Hey everyone, welcome to Judging for the Win. I'm Dave, and this is my daily ruling. Today I'm covering probably the most asked about card in the new Final Fantasy set. And unlike last time, it's not just a case of weird templating. The Water Crystal has a very uncommon effect, showing up on only one other card in Magic's history, and it turns out there are some complications that show up when you replace a mill additively rather than multiplicatively. As a result, this card raises some questions that don't normally have game significance, and so aren't particularly well known. I'll start with the most basic case and gradually increase the complexity so that we can use the easier examples as a platform to build our way to the more interesting ones. So first off, the very basics. Amy plays a Glimpse the Unthinkable against Nick while she controls the Water Crystal. What happens? Okay, so pretty straightforward here. The Water Crystal sees that Nick is about to mill one or more cards, so instead, it's going to replace that event with him milling that many plus 4 instead. Nick will therefore mill 14 cards. One important thing to note is that this is different from him milling 10 and then milling 4 more. All 14 cards are officially put into Nick's graveyard as part of the same game event. One consequence of this is that it affects how many times a card like Devourer of Memory will trigger. Since all 14 cards were milled at the same time, it only triggers once. Another consequence is that when multiple cards are put into your graveyard at the same time, you can choose the order. Therefore, if there is a Nether Shadow in the 4 additional cards, Nick is free to put that into his graveyard first, underneath all the other cards that he's milling, even if that does not correspond to the position it was at in his library. I talked about this more in my video on Nether Shadow and Golgari Grave Troll, and there's some more info in my video titled Can You Reorder Your Graveyard? So you can check those out if you would like some more details. Finally, the third consequence that I want to talk about has to do with cards like Progenitus. Since we're milling all 14 cards together, that means it is not possible to mill the same Progenitus twice during this sequence, whereas this might happen if it was milling 10 and then milling 4. Check out my video on Glimpse the Unthinkable and World Spine Worm for more analysis of this sort of situation. Okay, so I think everybody should be good on that aspect of how the Water Crystal functions. So let's take a look at another question. When does its effect apply? Well, as you can see on the card, it applies anytime an opponent would mill one or more cards. Well, most of that's pretty self-explanatory, but there is one thing that has the potential to trip some people up, and that is the opponent has to officially be milling. In order to count, the effect has to actually use the word mill. Now that's fine for this Glimpse the Unthinkable that we saw earlier. It says mill right there on the card, so we're definitely good. We're still good even if we use one of these OG Glimpse the Unthinkables that predates the existence of mill as a keyword action. The Oracle text says mill, so that means we are officially considered to be milling. So the Water Crystal can apply to that. Same thing goes for this Tome Scour, even though there isn't yet a printing of this card that uses the keyword. What about if you dredge 6 with this Golgari Grave Troll? Well, it doesn't say mill anywhere on the card or the Oracle text, but if you check in the comprehensive rules, you can see that the definition for dredge does include that word, so that would count. On the other hand, if you hit 20 cards off Tasha's Hideous Laughter, you might colloquially say that you milled 20, but the Oracle wording of this card says no such thing. Likewise, you aren't considered to have milled with Grisly Salvage, even if you break and put all 5 cards into your graveyard. Wizards of the Coast said in their release notes for this set that a general rule of thumb is that effects that involve looking at or revealing cards before they're put into the graveyard are generally not going to officially count as milling, but there's really no way to know for sure unless you look it up every time. This is something I always harp on, but it's especially important here since mill was keyworded relatively recently, meaning a lot of cards that work with the Water Crystal don't have a printing that makes this clear. Next up, let's take a look at this Trenchpost. We'll say that you have another locus, so when you activate this land, your opponent will mill 2. How many is that with the Water Crystal? Well, the important thing that we need to know here is that the Water Crystal only affects each instance of milling once. So that means that if a player is instructed to mill 2 cards, the Water Crystal will add 4 to that, so they end up milling 6. On the other hand, if a player is instructed to mill 1 card and then another, the Water Crystal will add 4 to both of those, so they end up milling 10. So which is it in this case? Well, anytime an effect tells you to mill a card for each something, you calculate the total number of cards that you're going to mill, and then all those cards go to your graveyard at the same time. This is based on the principle that one verb corresponds to one game action. If you have an instruction to do one verb to multiple game objects, you apply that effect to all those objects simultaneously as part of a single game event. Therefore, if target player mills a card for each locus you control, they'll end up milling for 4 plus the total number of loci you control, not 5 for each one. Bruvac did not have this problem because multiplication is distributive over addition. It doesn't matter whether the effect is applied to each individual card milled or the whole lot all at once. The end result is the same. And hey, what if you have both Bruvac and the water crystal out at once? Well, because both addition and multiplication are associative, it should be pretty uncontroversial to say that 2 Bruvacs would quadruple the number of mills and 2 crystals would add 8. But having one of each is a little bit more interesting. If you've been a fan of the channel for a while now, you know that both Bruvac and the water crystal have replacement effects, and if 2 of those want to modify how an event affects a player, that player gets to choose the order they apply. So if Amy casts a Glimpse the Unthinkable against Nick while Olive controls a Bruvac and Pat controls a crystal, that would mean that Nick, the one who is getting affected by this event, is the one who chooses the order for the 2 replacement effects to apply. Depending on his choice, it's possible that he'll end up milling either 24 or 28 cards. Note that the answer would be the same no matter which of Nick's opponents controlled any of these effects. Check out my video on Torbrand and Furnace of Wrath for more information on this rule. Alright, there's one last broad topic that I want to cover before I set everyone loose on some challenge questions. A lot of cards will have you mill a card and then do something based on what you milled, and it's not immediately obvious how such effects interact with the water crystal having you mill multiple. For example, let's say you mill 5 cards off this Heed the Mists. What would you do? And the answer is that if Heed the Mists milled multiple cards, you would draw cards equal to the sum of all the milled cards' mana values. Likewise, if any of the cards that you mill with a Lorehold Excavation is a land, you'll gain 1 life. In general, anytime you see something refer to a milled card, the controller of the ability chooses which card is affected, whereas if something refers to the milled card, then all the cards that were milled get considered. And with that, let's try out a couple of challenge questions to test your understanding. First up, let's say you play this Mind Funeral while you control the water crystal, and the 1st, 3rd, 6th, and 10th cards revealed are lands. How many cards do you get mill in total? And this is a bit of a trick. Mind Funeral doesn't actually use the word mill anywhere on it, so the water crystal doesn't do anything at all. Remember to always check the Oracle text if you're not sure. Okay, here's a bit fairer of a question. Amy activates a Charmed Pendant into the water crystal. What happens? And just like the Heed the Mists example, the mana cost is considered to be the combined mana cost of all 5 cards that were milled. A lot of mana there. Alright, what about this? Amy attacks with Anowon the Ruins Thief while she controls the water crystal. If Nick doesn't block, what happens? Okay, so Anowon will make Nick mill a card for each damage that it dealt. Now, just like the Trenchpost example, that means he will mill 2 cards at once, which the crystal increases to 6. If any of those 6 is a creature card, Amy gets to draw. Let's contrast this with Mesmeric Orb. Now, if this card said whenever a player untaps 1 or more permanents, that player mills that many cards, well, that would mean that untapping several permanents all at once would constitute only a single instance of milling, meaning that 4 cards would get added to that total. But that's not what Mesmeric Orb says. It triggers once for each permanent that untaps, and each of those triggers constitutes a discrete instance of milling when it resolves. Accordingly, the Mesmeric Orb and the Water Crystal will combine to mill 5 cards for each permanent your opponents untap. Ouch. Finally, let's take a look at this Demonic Covenant. Suppose Amy has one of these and Nick has the Water Crystal. What happens? Well, at the end of Amy's turn, she will mill 2 cards, and that will be turned into milling 6. Now, if any 2 of these cards have exactly the same card types, Amy will have to sacrifice Demonic Covenant. This could be 2 sorceries or 2 artifact creatures, but not a creature and an artifact creature, because those do not share all of their card types. So that would still be okay. Still, though, it's pretty unlikely that Amy could keep her Covenant around. I figured that by now everyone had probably already heard about how the Water Crystal works with Sphinx's tutelage, so I wanted to end on something a little bit different to make it a bit harder. If you hadn't heard about that one yet, it works very similarly. If any 2 of the 6 cards are non-land and share a color, you would repeat this process. Frank Karsten worked out that you're over 80% to one-shot a monocolored opponent with this combo, assuming that they play a normal number of lands, which at the very least is pretty amusing. But that's all I have for you today. How did you do? Join me again next time for another Daily Ruling. Until then, I hope you have a great day.